Welcome back to the second video in ReFramework tutorial. Jennifer is a junior developer, who will join me in this video to help me explaining the ReFramework template. Hi Jennifer.
Hello everybody. Thanks for having me in this video today.
You're welcome Jennifer. Today I want to explain the first state in ReFramework template, but before that let's check if you are ready to watch this video or if you need to do some preparations. I will ask you some questions, and if you answer yes for all questions, then you are ready to watch this video.
Okay, let's go.
Do you know State Machine and how to work using it? Or did you watch these two videos about State Machine on my channel?
Yeah, I did.
Do you know how to use try catch in UiPath, or did you watch this video on my channel?
Yeah, I did.
Do you know what does dictionary mean, and how to use it in UiPath? Or did you watch this video on my channel?
Yes, I watched the video, and also the other video about converting a data table into a dictionary using LINQ query.
Okay, that's good. Then you know what does a config file and ReFramework contain and how to use it. And the last question, did you watch the first video in ReFramework tutorial, where I explained the template in general and what does a business process mean?
Yes, I also watched this video.
Very good, then you are ready to continue, and if you need to recap, I will attach the links of these videos in the video description for you.
That would be awesome, thanks.
You're welcome. I will start now. As mentioned in the first video, ReFramework template based on a state machine. This state machine consists of 4 states. In this video I will talk about the first state, initialization. I will also talk about all workflows, variables and arguments, which are defined in this template, and are used in this state. So we have the following variables in ReFramework, which are automatically created once we create a process using this template. From these variables we only need 2 variables in the first state. System exception and config. System exception is of type exception. It's used during transitions between states, to represent exceptions other than business exceptions. It means, we use it to define which transition should be selected after executing the first state. For example, if we have a system exception, the transition system exception will be selected, which navigate the process to the end process state. But if we don't have a system exception, the success transition is selected and the execution continues with the next state, get transaction data. The second variable is config of type, dictionary of string object. It has a dictionary structure to store configuration data of the process. The data saved in this variable are from the config file, which has these 3 sheets: settings, constants, and assets. I talked about these 3 sheets in the config file video on my channel. Jennifer, you mentioned that you watched the config file video on my channel. Would you like to summarize the sheets in config file and the most important points?
Yeah, sure, I will try to summarize the sheets. So we have in the config file 3 default sheets: settings, constants, and assets. But we can also add new sheets, if we need to store another data. Settings and constants sheets have 3 columns: name, value, and description. In the name column we set always the name, which we want to use in the process, for example process name, queue name, etc. Using this name we can get the text from the second column, value. In this column we set the values for each name. For example, for the queue name we set here the queue name, for example ReFramework queue. To get this value we use the name content in the process. And the last column is description, where we write some description for each line in the config file, so that we know what does this line contain. We don't need this column in the process, only the first 2 columns, name and value. Later in the process we read the both sheets as data table, but we convert then to dictionary. And dictionary contains key and value. The content of column name is the key, and the content of the value column is the value in the dictionary. And we convert the data table into a dictionary, because dictionary is easier to use in the process, so that we don't need any loops to get a specific value. We only use the key to get the value. To get the queue name, for example, we write the following statement. As a result we get the following value. That's all about the first 2 sheets. And the last sheet, assets, is used to store the different assets, which are stored in Orchestrator and we want to use in the process. So here we have no asset values, but only the asset names. Later in the process we read this sheet. And for each line we get the asset value using getAssetActivity. The value will be stored in the values of the first two sheets. But here is important to know that we can use this sheet only for simple assets, like string, number, or boolean. But we cannot use it for credentials assets. And the second important thing to know here, that the name in assets should be the same as in the first two sheets, so that we can overwrite it. For example, in settings sheet we define this line. And in assets sheet we define this line. As you see, we have the same name in both sheets. Now we can fetch the asset value from orchestrator. Then we store the value in settings sheet. In assets sheet we also have a column, orchestrator asset folder, where we can write the folder name from orchestrator, if the asset is not directly stored in the default folder, but another folder in orchestrator. That's all about the third sheet, what I learned in the config file video. Is it correct, or did I forget something important?
No, everything is correct. Very good summarized, thank you, Jennifer. That's all about the used variables in this state. Let's now see the arguments. We only have one argument in the main process, which we can use if we want, but it's not important to use it as argument. This argument is the QName. It allows the orchestrator QName to be passed as an argument, instead of only being defined in the configuration file. Normally we define the QName in the config file, but as mentioned we can use this argument to get the QName as input for the process. And the last point is workflows. We have 8 workflows in ReFramework, but in the first state we only use 3 workflows. These are, InitAllApplications, KillAllProcesses, InitAllSettings. So in this video I will only talk about these 3 workflows. I will first talk about the workflows in general, what we do in each workflow, then I will explain these in details later. Let's start with the first one, InitAllApplications. We can use this workflow to start the applications we need in the process later. For example, if your process works in browser and you need to log in into a specific page, you can write the login code in this workflow. The next workflow is KillAllProcesses. Here we can kill all applications we used in the process, in case we have an error. But note here, that the killing might have undesirable outcomes, such as losing unsaved changes to the files. And the last workflow we use in the first state is InitializeAllSettings. In this workflow we read the config file and get the assets values from orchestrator. The data will be stored in config variable. It's the dictionary variable. We use this variable later throughout the process. Jennifer, do you have any questions about the variables, arguments and workflows?
No, everything is clear, thanks for the explanation. But would you explain the different activities within the first state?
Yes, sure, that's what I will do now.
Okay, thanks.
Here is my process in UiPath. I am now in main workflow. As you see, I have here a state machine. It consists of 4 states. 1, 2, 3, 4. As mentioned, I will talk in this video only about the first state, initialization. Let's see the variables, which I have in the process. As you see, here are all variables for the process. And as mentioned, we only need these 2 variables in the first state. I also have only one argument, orchestrator QName. It's an argument for the process, so we can set the value in orchestrator, or we can also set a default value here, if we want to use this argument. But you can also set the QName in the config file. And here we have the workflows under framework folder. We only use these 3 workflows in the first state. Let's see the first state. What does it contain? We have here only one activity, try catch. And we have 2 transitions from this state. Each transition leads to a state in the state machine. The first one navigates to get transaction data state. And the second one navigates to end process state. In exit sector we don't have any activities. Let's see the try catch activity. Here we have 3 activities. The first one is to set an empty value for the variable system exception. After that we have an if activity. Here we check first, if the config variable contains data. If the variable contains data, it means that this run is not the first run and we don't need to do the steps here. But if the variable doesn't contain any values, it means that this run is the first one. What I mean with first run is, that in case of exception in the next states we move again to this state, but we already read the config file at the beginning, therefore we don't need to read the config file again. Assume we are in the first run, so this workflow will be executed. Then we check the argument, if it contains a value. If there is a value, we add it into the config variable. But if we don't have a value, nothing will be executed here. And in the next step the workflow KillAllProcesses will be executed. Then we add log fields using this activity. After that the workflow InitAllApplications will be executed. These are the activities in try section. In case we have an exception in this section, we move on to catch section. Here we only have one activity. Here is the exception assigned to the system exception variable. It means, no exception will be thrown in this state, but we only store the occurred exception in this variable. And in finally section we don't have any activities. This was a briefly explanation for the activities. Let's now dive into the different activities and workflows. Here we have the workflow, where we read the config file. As you see, we have the following arguments. We have 2 input arguments, and 1 output argument. The first argument is the path of the config file. As you see here is the config path under data folder. The next argument is an array, which contains the sheet names. Here we only need to set the first 2 sheets, which have a dictionary structure. I mean these 2 sheets contains name and value columns, which can be later stored as dictionary with key and value. If you also have other sheets, which also has the dictionary structure, you can add them here. You don't need to add the assets sheet here, because we read this sheet another way. And the last argument is the output of this workflow, which will be stored in config variable. It means, we read the config file in this workflow and store it into a dictionary variable. This variable is an output for the first state, which we can use in the whole process. Let's open this workflow. First we need to initialize the dictionary using this statement. Then we have for each loop. In this loop we go through the sheets, which we got as input argument. It means we go through the sheet settings and constants. For each sheet we read the sheet content. Here is the file path, which we also got as input argument. And here you can see, that we use the sheet variable, which is defined in the loop structure. The output of this activity will be stored in this variable. It's of type data table. So for each row in this data table we add the rows into the dictionary. First we check if the name column content is not empty. As mentioned, we set the name column content as key, and the value column content as value. This can be done using this activity. So here we take the name column content and set it as key. And here we set the value column content and set it as value. So after executing this loop we have the content of the both sheets, settings and constants, in the config argument. After that we have a try-catch activity to read the assets sheet. We have this scope in try section. In case of exception we move on to catch section. Here we only have this log message activity. And in finally section we don't have any activities. Let's see what happens in try section. First we read the assets sheet. Here is again the config file path, and the sheet name. The data will be stored in assets variable. It's also of type data table. For each row in this data table we get first the asset from orchestrator. For this we need the asset name. It's what we stored in asset column on assets sheet. The value will be saved into this variable. After that we add the asset name and value into the dictionary. It's also the same as we did for the previous sheets. For key we take the name column content. But for value we set the asset value, which we got from Orchestrator. So after executing this activity we have also the assets, and they are stored into the dictionary. Once this workflow is executed, we go back again to the first state, initialization. So we got the config file and stored it into the variable, config of type dictionary. In this stage we check the argument orchestrator QName, if it contains a value. If it contains a value, it will be added into the config variable, but if it doesn't contain any value, nothing will happen here. Then we move on to the next step, invoke KillAllProcesses Workflow. As you see we don't have any arguments for this workflow. Let's see what we have in this workflow. So we only have a log message activity. If you have any applications, which are used in the process and you want to kill before start the execution, you can do that here. You can use for example kill process activity. For this activity you need to enter the process name. You can either enter the process name directly, or you can use a variable or argument, which contains the process name. After that we add log fields into the logs, if we need that. You can here define, which log fields you want to add. Here we only added the process name as new log field. But you can add also other log fields, if you need that in your process, so that you can better monitor the steps during the execution. It means, the log field name is called _business process name. And the value for this field will be the content from config file. So we get the content from the config using this key. Jennifer, do you have any questions up to this point?
Yes, I just wanted to ask about this activity, add log fields. Which log fields do you mean exactly? And do you mean that we only have this field in the logs later? And we have to add each log field we want in the process?
I mean the log fields for each log message in Orchestrator. If you are in Orchestrator under Jobs. If you open the logs of a job, you see all log messages of this job. For each log message you can click on View Details. You will see the following log fields for each log message entry. These are the default log fields. And if you use the activity add log fields, you will see the new log field in the logs here. As you see we have a new log field here. Here is the name as we defined it in the activity add log fields. And we can also add other log fields later in the process. You also can add more than one log field in one activity. Each log field will be visible in the logs up from this activity. You can also delete the log field later in the process, if you don't need it anymore for the other activities.
Okay, and what is the advantage of using this fields? And is it a must-have?
It helps you to better analyze the logs in case of exceptions, so that you can know where the exception has occurred and you have more details. For example, if you use different mailboxes, you can add a mailbox log field. And you fill in this field with the currently used mailbox. In this way you know for each exception, which mailbox is used. So you can better analyze the process, and you can also easier and faster debug the bot. And it's not a must-have, but nice to have.
Thanks for the explanation. Now I got it.
No problem. Let's continue. After this activity we have invoke workflow file activity, to execute the third workflow in this state, InitAllApplications. We have here only one argument, the config variable. We use this variable in the workflow, because we may have data which is important to start an application. For example, we could have the URL in the config file, which we can use to open a website in the browser. Therefore we give the config as input argument to this workflow. But if we don't need this variable in the workflow, we can delete it from the arguments. Let's see the content of this workflow. So we only have a log message activity in this workflow now. But here as mentioned we can add the activities to start an application, for example to start the browser and log in into a website. These were the activities in try section in the first state. If we have an exception in this state, we move on to catch section. In this case we store the occurred exception in the system exception variable. Why we store it in this variable? Because using this variable we can define later, which transition should be selected after executing this state. We have here two transitions in this state. Let's see the condition of each transition. Successful transition has this condition. It means that we select this transition if we don't have any exception in this state. It means we select this transition if the system exception variable is empty. In this case, we move on to the state, get transaction data. The second transition is system exception. This transition is selected if we have an exception in this state. It means that the system exception variable is not empty. In this case, we have a log message activity. After that, we move on to the state and process. As mentioned, after the first state, if we don't have any exceptions, we go to this state. But if we have an exception, we move on to this state. That's all about the first state. Jennifer, do you have any questions?
Yes, I only have one question about the condition in the first state, if first run. What do you mean here? Why we need this condition? And when could we not be in the first run? It's unclear for me.
Okay, let's see why we use it. As you see here on the main page, we have the different states. Each state has different transitions to move from a state to another. The third state, process transaction, has 3 different transitions. Success and business rule exception navigate to the second state. But the third transition navigates again to the first state. This happens in case of system exceptions. In case of system exceptions, we only need to start the applications again, because the exception has occurred in an application. But we don't need to read the config file again, because we already read it at the beginning. Therefore, we have this condition to check if first run or not. In this way, we save time in the execution. And therefore, we don't have the invoke workflow file activity for InitAllApplications within this if scope. Is it now clear for you why we have this condition?
Yes, of course. Thanks a lot.
Jennifer, would you like to summarize what you learned in the video about the first state?
Sure. ReFramework is based on a state machine. This state machine consists of 4 states. In this video, you talked only about the first state, initialization. In this state, we do the preparations for the process, like reading the config file or starting the applications. The config file will be stored in a dictionary variable, because working with dictionary is easier than data table. We also get the assets from orchestrator and also store them in the dictionary variable. From this state, we can move on to 2 states. Either to end process state, if we got an exception in the first state, or to get transaction data state, in case everything is okay and there is no exception. And we have in the first state a condition to check if this run is the first run, so that we don't need to read the config file again, if we are not in the first run.
Very good summarized, Jennifer, thank you. And thanks for joining me in the video. That's all about the first state. I explained the state without any examples. But later I will explain some use cases, so that you can understand this state and also the other states in ReFramework. See you in the next video about the second state, get transaction data. Goodbye.